"Pretend you're me or we all die," the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm shrieked, shoving his $5,000 silk jacket at me while he hyperventilated in the galley of our Gulfstream G650. We were banking hard over the dark Atlantic, and I'd barely washed the Napa Valley dust off my boots before realizing the classified prototypes in the hold were actually advanced weapons components, and the Italian Mafia had the fuel lines rigged to blow. A video call from a stone-cold killer illuminated the phone on the counter, the timer ticking towards 0. I caught my reflection in the polished chrome, a trucker in a billionaire's skin, and realized that at 35,000 feet, there is no shoulder to pull over on. I straightened the lapels, checked the detonator screen, and prepared to lie. The weight of the world often rests on the shoulders of those quiet enough to carry it without a word of complaint. You're watching Highway Stories Untold. When the world turns a blind eye to the truth, strong souls like you step up, drop your experiences in the comments, and inspire the fight. The air up here is different than the air on the I-10. It's thinner, recycled, and smells like expensive leather and desperate lies. I'd only been out of Napa for 48 hours, still feeling the phantom ache in my knuckles from dismantling Donato's operation, and I was supposed to be heading east toward Florida to see Sarah. But an old military contact had reached out with a simple security favor, escorting high-value cargo on a private hop to Europe. I figured a few days in a pressurized cabin would be a hell of a lot easier than fighting my way through a wine cellar. I was wrong. I've hauled hazardous materials through ice storms in the Rockies and navigated protests in downtown Chicago, but I've never felt as exposed as I did standing in the cabin of that Gulfstream while the man who signed my paycheck collapsed into a heap of expensive fabric. Arthur Sterling, the CEO of Aegis Tech, was the kind of man who looked like he'd never seen a day of hard labor in his life. He had soft hands and eyes that shifted whenever the conversation got too real. We were 4 hours out of Teterboro, somewhere over the dark, churning expanse of the Atlantic, when the masks started to slip. I was back in the galley, pouring myself a black coffee and thinking about the porch light Sarah always leaves on for me, when I saw it. Sterling had left his encrypted satellite phone on the marble counter to use the lavatory. The screen lit up with a notification that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a business update. It was a schematic of the very plane we were sitting in, with a red glowing dot centered right on the fuel manifold. Below the image was a string of text in Italian that I didn't need a translator to understand. 47 million in Monero within 60 minutes, or the manifold triggers. Don't bother calling the cockpit, the pilots are ours. I set the coffee down, my hands steady even as the floor felt like it was dropping away. My mind immediately went into trucker mode, diagnosing the mechanical failure. If that manifold blew, the wings would shear off in a fireball before we even had time to scream. I've seen rigs go up in smoke on the shoulder, but at 35,000 feet, there's no bailing out. I looked toward the hold where the classified prototypes were latched down. I'd been told they were German tech components. Now, looking at the technical readouts on the phone, I realized they were guidance systems for mid-range missiles. Sterling wasn't just a CEO, he was a middleman for a weapons deal that had gone south. When Sterling stepped out of the lavatory, he saw me holding the phone. The blood drained from his face so fast, I thought he was going to faint. He didn't try to grab it. He just leaned against the bulkhead, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. "Jack, I can explain," he stammered, his voice cracking like a dry branch. "Save it," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a calm that usually scares people more than shouting does. "You've got a bomb on your fuel line, and the Mafia on the line. I'm an escort, not a martyr, Arthur. Who is this?" "It's Moretti," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the cockpit door. "The head of the Calabrian syndicate. He thinks I've been skimming from the shipment. He doesn't want the money, Jack. He wants to humiliate me before he kills us. He wants a video call. He wants to see me crawl." Sterling looked at me, and for a second, I saw a terrifying spark of calculation in his eyes. He looked at my height, my build, which wasn't too far off from his own, provided the lighting was dim, and then he looked at the suit jacket hanging on the chair. He's never seen me in person. Only low-res photos and encrypted voice comms. Jack, you have the voice. You have the presence. If I go on that screen, he'll see the fear. He'll trigger it just to watch me die. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my forearm. Pretend you're me or we all die. Take the suit. Take the identity. Negotiate. Buy the pilot's time to find a way to override the frequency. You're a major, right? You've done this? Please. I looked at his trembling hands and then at the countdown timer that had just appeared on the phone. 52 minutes. I thought about the road, the hum of the tires, and the simple honesty of a long-haul run. This was the opposite of that. This was a world of shadows and silk, but I also knew that if I didn't step up, that manifold would turn us into confetti over the ocean. I didn't like Sterling, but there were flight attendants on this plane, young kids just doing their jobs, and I wasn't going to let them die for a coward's debt. "Give me the jacket," I growled. The transition was surreal. I stripped off my work shirt, the one with the faint scent of diesel and home, and pulled on a crisp, white Egyptian cotton shirt that cost more than my first truck. The silk tie felt like a noose, but I knotted it with the precision I used to secure a heavy load. Sterling was frantically whispering details, account numbers, names of associates, the specific terminology of the guidance systems. I tuned out the fluff and focused on the tactical. I needed to know the receipts, the leverage. "What do we have on him?" I asked, checking my reflection. I looked like a man who owned the sky, but my eyes were still the eyes of a guy who'd seen too many miles of blacktop. "The shipment," Sterling said, his voice shaking. "He needs the components for a buyer in North Africa. If the plane blows, he loses the payday and his reputation with the buyers. That's all we've got." "It's enough," I said. I sat down in the high-backed leather captain's chair in the main cabin, positioning the satellite camera so the lighting was dramatic and obscured the finer details of my face. I placed the phone on the mahogany table in front of me. The countdown was at 44 minutes. The call chimed, a jarring digital sound that echoed through the silent cabin. Sterling scrambled into the lavatory, locking the door behind him. I was alone in the sky with a killer. I took a breath, letting the Redline persona take over, the version of me that handled the high-stress deployments back in the service, the one who didn't blink when the stakes were terminal. I swiped the screen. The face that appeared was sharp, weathered, and framed by a backdrop of a dark office somewhere in Italy. Moretti didn't look like a thug. He looked like a predator who had forgotten what it was like to lose. He stared at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he took me in. "Sterling," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "you look different than your profile." "Pressure has a way of changing a man, Moretti," I said, my voice steady as a rock, leaning forward into the frame. "But let's skip the pleasantries. You've got a timer running on my fuel line, and I've got a cargo hold full of your future. You want to talk about the 47 million? Or do you want to talk about why you're about to become the man who blew up his own retirement plan?" I could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He expected a whimpering CEO, a man pleading for his life. Instead, he got a trucker who had dealt with every kind of bully from the loading docks to the desert sands. I watched his hand move off screen, likely toward a detonator or a control board. "You're bold for a man in a flying coffin," Moretti remarked, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "The money hasn't moved. Why should I keep you in the air?" "Because," I said, reaching into the pocket of the expensive jacket and pulling out a small metallic component Sterling had given me, a dummy chip from the prototypes. I held it up to the camera. "Because I've already rerouted the shipping manifests. If this plane doesn't land in one piece at the designated coordinates, the decryption keys for these guidance systems are deleted. You'll have the hardware, but it'll be nothing more than expensive paperweights. You think your buyers will be patient with that?" It was a total bluff, a receipt I'd manufactured on the fly based on Sterling's panicked ramblings, but I delivered it with the absolute certainty of a man holding a royal flush. I watched Moretti's face, looking for the tell. The cabin groaned as we hit a pocket of turbulence, the plane shuddering violently. I didn't even blink. I kept my gaze locked on the lens, staring through the thousands of miles of fiber optics directly into his soul. 39 minutes, Moretti, I said, the silence of the cabin amplifying the weight of my words. What's it going to be? Do we do business, or do we all go down together? Moretti's eyes didn't leave mine, and for a long stretch of silence, the only sound was the low, persistent hum of the jet engines fighting the thin Atlantic air. I could feel the silk of Sterling's jacket rubbing against my neck, a constant reminder that I was playing a character in a play where the stage was rigged to explode. I've sat in inspection stations with a bad logbook and a nervous sweat, but that was nothing compared to the cold, calculated stare of a man who held a detonator thousands of miles away. My internal clock was ticking louder than the one on the screen. You have a lot of iron in your blood for a man who sells microchips, Sterling, Moretti finally said, his voice dropping an octave. But iron melts. My engineers tell me that if I trigger the manifold, the fuel will atomize instantly. You won't even feel the cold before you're gone. Then do it, I said, leaning back and crossing my arms with a casualness I didn't truly feel. If you wanted us dead, we would have been a fireball over the coast of Maine. You want the 47 million, and you want those guidance systems delivered to your contact in the Mediterranean. If I die, you get a hole in the ocean and a lot of angry buyers asking why you couldn't handle a simple transport. I saw his jaw tighten. I'd hit the injustice pillar. The bully was realizing his loud threats weren't moving the mountain. He was used to people pleading. He wasn't used to a man who looked at death like it was just another long-haul shift in bad weather. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the cabin. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't turn my head. I kept my eyes locked on the camera. It was the mid-action clash. One of the flight attendants had been intercepted by a shadow by the cargo hold. One of the pilots Moretti claimed to own had stepped out of the cockpit. "Check the feed, Moretti," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a jake brake on a steep grade. "One of your boys is getting restless. If he touches my cargo before we land, the deal is off. I don't care if the plane is still in the air." Moretti looked off camera, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation. "Vincenzo, stay in the seat," he barked in Italian. The irreversible change had started. The situation was no longer a static video call. It was a kinetic struggle for control of the aircraft. I knew I had to move. I couldn't just sit in this leather chair and talk my way to the ground. I needed to establish active dominance. "I'm going to check on my flight crew," I told Moretti, standing up and grabbing the satellite phone. "Keep the camera on. I want you to see exactly how much control I still have over this bird." I walked toward the galley, the phone held out like a torch. As I rounded the corner, I saw him, a tall, lean man in a pilot's uniform, but with the dead eyes of a mercenary. He had the lead flight attendant, a girl no older than 20, pinned against the bulkhead. He was holding a plastic zip tie, ready to silence her. "Step away from her," I said. It wasn't a request. The pilot laughed, looking at my expensive suit. "The boss said to keep you in the chair, billionaire. Go back and play with your phone." He didn't see the trucker. He didn't see the years of throwing chains in the mud, or the combat training that lay beneath the silk. He lunged at me, swinging a heavy fist meant to end the conversation quickly. I moved before he could finish the arc. I didn't use a flashy move. I used the leverage I'd learned from decades of hauling heavy freight. I caught his wrist, pivoted my hips, and slammed him into the edge of the marble galley counter. The sound of his breath leaving his lungs was the most honest thing I'd heard all flight. I followed up with a sharp elbow to the ribs, feeling the bone give way just enough to let him know I wasn't playing. He went down hard, gasping for air on the plush carpet. I didn't stop to admire the work. I grabbed his radio and his sidearm, a compact 9mm, and tucked it into the small of my back. I looked at the terrified flight attendant. "Get into the lavatory with the CEO," I whispered, my voice softening just a fraction. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I say my name is Jack. Understand?" She nodded, tears streaking her face, and scrambled toward the back. I turned back to the satellite phone, which I'd propped up on the counter to capture the tail end of the struggle. Moretti was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. The quiet protector had just revealed his teeth. "Your pilot is having a nap, Moretti," I said, breathing hard but keeping my voice level. "Now let's talk about that manifold. You've got 31 minutes. I'm going into the cockpit now to have a word with the other one. If I see a red light on my dashboard, I'm turning this plane into a lawn dart, right into your primary warehouse in Gioia Toro. I've got the GPS coordinates burned into my brain. You think I'm bluffing? Try me." I was leaning into the escalation logic. I'd taken a physical risk, exposed my ability to fight, and closed the escape route for his man on board. The strategic situation had changed. Moretti no longer had the only gun in the room. I headed for the cockpit door, my hand on the cold steel of the stolen pistol. I could feel the plane beginning to descend, a subtle change in the pressure in my ears. We were dropping into the denser air of the European coast. "Jack!" Sterling's voice hissed from the lavatory door as I passed. "What are you doing? He'll blow us up." "He's already trying to blow us up, Arthur," I muttered without looking back. "Now I'm just making sure he's the one who loses the most when he does." I reached the cockpit door. It was locked from the inside. I knew the second pilot wouldn't open it for a CEO. I had to use a different kind of receipt, a tactical one. I remembered what Sterling had said about the pilots being ours, meaning Moretti's. If they were mercenaries, they followed the money, but they also followed the strength. I tapped on the door with the barrel of the gun. "Open up," I said, not as Sterling, but as the man who had just dismantled their backup in the galley. "Your boss in Italy is watching this on a live feed. He's about to lose 47 million and his best shipment of the year because you're flying a plane that's about to become a bomb. If you want to live to spend your paycheck, you'll unlock this door and help me bypass the manifold trigger." I waited, the tension in the narrow hallway thick enough to choke on. The anxiety was peaking. If they opened fire through the door, it was over. But I'd bet on their greed. A mercenary doesn't want to die for a cause. He wants to get paid for a job. The lock clicked. The cockpit door swung inward, and the sudden change in air pressure made my ears pop with a sharp metallic sting. The co-pilot, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow and a flight suit that looked too tight for his frame, had his hand halfway to a holstered weapon. I didn't give him the chance to complete the thought. I stepped into the cramped, glowing space of the flight deck, the nose of the stolen 9mm lead the way. The anxiety in the room was a living thing, vibrating against the glass of the windshield as we began a steep, uncommanded descent through the first layers of European cloud cover. "Hands where I can see them, and keep your feet off the rudders," I commanded, my voice dropping into that low, rhythmic rumble I use when a load is shifting on a mountain pass and there's no room for error. The pilot in the left seat didn't turn around. He was busy fighting the yoke, his knuckles white against the black leather. "The frequency is locked," he shouted over the chime of a master caution alarm. Moretti's bypass didn't just arm the manifold, it overrode the fuel pumps. "We're losing pressure in engine 2. If we don't level out, the cavitation is going to trigger the spark." This was the escalation, a change in the physical situation that couldn't be undone. We weren't just negotiating anymore. The machine itself was starting to fail. I held the satellite phone up so Moretti could see the chaos of the cockpit, the flashing red lights reflecting off the glass of the instruments like a digital funeral. "You see this, Moretti?" I shouted into the phone, ignoring the co-pilot as I moved behind the captain's seat. "Your pilots can't even hold the altitude. You're about to lose the guidance systems, the money, and the only man who knows how to unlock the encrypted manifests. Is that the legacy you want to leave behind? The man who fumbled the biggest haul of the decade because he couldn't control his own temper?" On the screen, Moretti's face was a mask of calculated fury, but I saw the vulnerability in the way he glanced at someone off camera. He was losing face in front of his own people. He was the villain who thought he had won, right until the quiet protector turned the stakes into a suicide pact. 22 minutes, Sterling, Moretti roared, still using the CEO's name. Transfer the Monero now, or I let the gravity finish what I started. I don't respond to threats from men sitting in offices, I said, my thumb hovering over the end call button. I'm going to put the phone down now. I'm going to help these men save this plane. If the signal goes dead, it's because we hit the water. And if we hit the water, your retirement goes to the bottom of the Atlantic. Your move, Moretti. I didn't wait for an answer. I clicked the screen black and shoved the phone into the pocket of the silk jacket. The action momentum had to be maintained. A story stalls when there's no movement. I turned my attention to the co-pilot, who was still eyeing the gun in my hand. You, I said, nodding toward the scar-faced man. You're a mercenary. You want to live to spend the money Moretti promised you? Then get out of that seat and get into the electronics bay beneath the floorboards. I need you to find the physical bypass for the fuel manifold. If it's rigged to a remote frequency, there has to be a receiver. Find it and cut the power to the detonator. It's shielded, he spat, but he was already unbuckling. The early loss of control had forced him to choose between his employer and his life. Then unshield it, I growled, stepping back to let him scramble past. I dropped into the co-pilot's seat, the leather still warm from his body. I've never flown a Gulfstream, but I've spent 30 years reading gauges and understanding the soul of heavy machinery. A fuel system is a fuel system, whether it's feeding a Cummins diesel or a Rolls-Royce jet engine. I looked at the primary flight display. We were at 18,000 feet and dropping at 4,000 feet per minute. The air was getting thick, the plane bucking as we hit the weather front moving off the coast of Ireland. Talk to me, Captain, I said, my hands hovering near the throttle quadrant. I can't get the pumps to prime, the pilot yelled, his voice strained. Moretti's virus is cycling the valves. It's creating a hammer effect in the lines. If a seal blows, the manifold won't even need a detonator. The friction will ignite the vapor. I looked at the receipt path, the hard proof that could flip the power dynamic. It wasn't on a screen this time. It was in the mechanical logs. I reached over and pulled the manual override lever for the fire suppression system, but I only pulled it halfway. A trick I'd used on an old rig when the air brakes were freezing up. It forced a diagnostic reset of the entire fuel bus. For a heartbeat, the cockpit went dark. The only sound was the whistling of the wind against the fuselage. Then, the lights flickered back to life, and the receipt appeared. A yellow warning light on the auxiliary panel that showed the location of the external override. There, I pointed, the bypass is active. Moretti's remote signal is being interrupted by the reset. Suddenly, the floor beneath us erupted in a shower of sparks. The co-pilot screamed from the electronics bay below. One of Moretti's failsafes had triggered, sending a high-voltage surge through the bay to keep anyone from tampering with the receiver. "He's killing his own man!" the pilot cried, his eyes wide with shock. I didn't hesitate. I unbuckled and dropped into the hole in the floor, my boots slamming into the narrow wire-choked space of the bay. The smell of ozone and burning insulation was thick enough to taste. The co-pilot was slumped against the bulkhead, his hands charred, but his eyes were still open. "The blue wire," he wheezed, pointing toward a small black box tucked behind the main oxygen tank. I reached for it, but the plane took a violent lurch to the left, throwing me against the sharp edge of a circuit rack. I felt a rib snap, a dull, familiar thud of pain that I pushed into the back of my mind. I had 17 minutes left. I grabbed the black box, my fingers fumbling with the casing as another surge of sparks danced across the ceiling of the bay. This was the mandatory early commitment. I was in the belly of the beast, and there was no way out but through. I ripped the casing off, revealing a nest of wires and a glowing red LED that was pulsing in time with the detonator on Moretti's phone. "I've got it," I yelled up to the cockpit. "But Moretti's still got the trigger." "Then give him a reason to let go," the pilot screamed back. I climbed back out of the bay, my suit jacket torn and stained with hydraulic fluid. I grabbed the satellite phone and hit redial. When Moretti's face appeared, I didn't say a word. I just held the phone over the open electronics bay, letting him see his dying mercenary and the smoking wreckage of his failsafe. 13 minutes, Moretti, I said, my voice as cold as the altitude outside. Your man is dead. Your hardware is fried, and I'm still flying. Do you want to see what happens next, or are you ready to talk about the receipts I found in Sterling's private files, the ones that link your Gioia Toro operation to the North African buyers by name? I saw the injustice turn to fear. The hunter had become the hunted. Moretti's face on the screen didn't just show anger anymore. It showed the frantic calculation of a man whose leverage was evaporating at 400 knots. I stood in the vibrating cockpit, my snapped rib burning with every breath, and held the satellite phone steady. The receipt I was holding over his head wasn't a digital file. It was the hard proof of his own failure. I'd seen the fear in Sterling's eyes earlier, but now I saw it in the villain who thought he was untouchable. We were at 12,000 feet, the Irish coastline a dark, jagged line through the rain-streaked windshield. 10 minutes, Moretti, I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, intimidating growl that cut through the cockpit alarms. I just pulled your mercenary out of the floorboards. He's got third-degree burns, and he's singing like a bird about your North African buyers. You think 47 million is worth the international heat I'm about to drop on your doorstep? I've got the official records of every shell company you've used to move these guidance systems. It was the twist reveal, using his own hidden history to bury him. I watched him look off camera again, but this time his confidence was gone. He knew that if I lived, his entire syndicate was a public humiliation waiting to happen. What do you want? He hissed, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Disarm the manifold. Now, I commanded. Hero-driven action, fueling my words. And tell your pilot to put this bird on the ground at Shannon Airport. If I see one more red light on this dash, I'm hitting send on a pre-timed email to the Interpol task force in Rome. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the kinetic thrum of the engines. Then a change in the strategic situation occurred that could not be undone. The master caution light on the center console blinked once and turned a steady, peaceful green. The hard receipt of the manifold disarming was the hell yes moment the crew needed. It's off, the pilot breathed, his shoulders sagging as he gripped the yoke. The override is clear, we've got fuel pressure again. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just looked back at Moretti. Smart choice, now stay off my frequency. If I ever see your name on a manifest again, I won't be calling, I'll be coming. I swiped the screen, ending the call and exposing the lie once and for all. I leaned against the bulkhead, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. I walked back into the main cabin. The door to the lavatory opened slowly, and Arthur Sterling stepped out, looking like a man who had just returned from his own funeral. He looked at my torn suit, the blood on my knuckles, and the calm confidence in my eyes. Is it over? He whispered. The bomb is dead, I said, stripping off the silk jacket and tossing it onto the leather seat like the piece of injustice it was. But your career is on life support, Arthur. We're landing in Ireland. There will be witness testimony waiting on the tarmac, and I'm the first one in line to give it. He started to protest, his villainous entitlement trying to resurface, but I stepped into his space, the quiet protector making his final move. You put kids' lives at risk for a guidance system. You're lucky I'm letting you walk off this plane at all. We touched down at Shannon 20 minutes later, the tires screaming against the wet runway in a high-intensity sequence of smoke and rubber. As the engine spooled down into a whistle, the silence that followed was the heaviest thing I'd felt all day. I watched from the window as authority in the form of Irish Gardaí swarmed the plane, but I didn't wait for the salute. I grabbed my old work shirt, the one that smelled like the road and home, and pulled it on. I walked down the air stairs into the cool night air, the smell of rain and peat moss, a welcome change from the shadows and silk of the cabin. I didn't want the money or the prestige. I just wanted the humming of a diesel engine and a lane that led back to Sarah. The cockpit was silent as the wheels locked into the tarmac, the screaming of the turbines finally dying down into a low, mournful whistle. I stayed in my seat for a long moment, my hands still vibrating from the yoke, watching the blue and red lights of the Irish authorities reflect off the rain-streaked windshield. I'd traded my dignity for a suit and a lie to keep this bird in the air, but as I stepped out of that cramped flight deck, I felt the heavy weight of the quiet protector begin to lift. I walked past Sterling, who was already trying to straighten his tie and find his villainous composure, but I didn't give him a second glance. I grabbed my old grease-stained work shirt from the galley, the fabric feeling like a suit of armor compared to the silk I'd just stripped off. I descended the air stairs into the biting Atlantic wind, the smell of jet fuel and salt air filling my lungs. The Gardaí were moving in, and I saw a senior official pause when he saw the way I carried myself. Not like a billionaire, but like a man who had seen the stolen honor of the world and refused to let it stand. I gave them the hard receipts I'd pulled from the electronics bay and the recording of the call, the truth that would ensure Sterling and Moretti both found themselves in a much smaller room than a Gulfstream cabin. My part was done. I wasn't looking for a salute or a payout. I just wanted the honesty of the white lines and the hum of a real engine. As I walked toward the terminal, I looked up at the moon hanging over the Irish coast and thought about the porch light Sarah had left on back in Florida. I had a long way to go, but for the first time in 48 hours, the road ahead looked clear. The truth doesn't need a golden pedestal to stand on, just a steady hand and the courage to speak it when the world is screaming for a lie. If this story reminded you that some things are worth standing up for, no matter how much time has passed, hit that subscribe button and join the convoy. We're building a community here of people who believe in honor, the truth, and looking out for the person in the lane next to you. Drop a horizon in the comments if you've ever had to face down a ghost of your own. And if you want, tell us about it. It's an honor to have you riding. I'll see you on the next haul. Stay safe out there.